The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Kensington Palace as Princess Charlotte walked through the grand corridor, her small shoes clicking softly against the polished stone. She had just turned 8 years old. Today was supposed to be a celebration of her achievements at the local charity event where she had helped raise funds for underprivileged children. Her cheeks were still flushed with excitement from the morning's activities, and she carried a small bouquet of flowers that one of the children had given her. Charlotte had always been taught to be kind, humble, and compassionate. Her parents, the Prince and Princess of Wales, had made sure that, despite her royal status, she understood the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. She spent her days attending school like any other child, playing with her brothers and learning about the responsibilities that came with being part of the royal family. Today had been special because she got to see firsthand how her efforts could make a real difference in people's lives. As she made her way toward the private drawing room where her grandmother usually took afternoon tea, Charlotte noticed an unusual amount of activity in the palace. Staff members were rushing about, their faces tense with concern. Something felt different, almost electric in the air. She clutched her flowers a little tighter and continued walking, her curiosity growing with each step. The Dowager Queen Elizabeth, Charlotte's great-grandmother, had arrived at the palace unexpectedly that morning. She was a woman of considerable age and even more considerable authority. Having served as queen for decades before passing the crown to her son, she still commanded immense respect, and some would say, fear within the royal household. Her ways were old-fashioned, rooted in traditions that stretched back centuries. She believed in strict protocol, rigid hierarchy, and the absolute importance of maintaining royal dignity at all times. The Dowager Queen had spent her entire life upholding these values, and she had little patience for what she perceived as the modern royal family's increasingly casual approach to their duties. She had watched with growing disapproval as her grandson and his wife raised their children with what she considered to be far too much freedom and far too little emphasis on royal protocol. In her view, royal children should be seen and not heard, should understand their place in the hierarchy, and should never, ever forget that they were different from common people. Charlotte reached the drawing room door, which stood slightly ajar. She could hear voices inside, one of them unmistakably belonging to the Dowager Queen. The elderly woman's voice was sharp and cutting, filled with the kind of authority that had silenced prime ministers and ambassadors throughout her long reign. Charlotte hesitated, suddenly unsure whether she should enter. Her parents had always encouraged her to be confident, but something about her great-grandmother's tone made her stomach twist with nervousness. Inside the room, the Dowager Queen sat in a high-backed chair, her posture absolutely perfect despite her advanced age. She wore a deep purple dress with multiple strands of pearls, and her silver hair was styled in the same elaborate manner she had favored for 50 years. Her eyes, though dimmed by age, still held a piercing quality that seemed to look right through anyone who stood before her. She had been informed about Charlotte's activities that morning, and she was deeply displeased. Several palace staff members stood nervously along the walls of the room, their eyes downcast. They had served the royal family for years, but the Dowager Queen's visits always put everyone on edge. She had a way of finding fault with even the smallest details, and her criticism could be withering. Today, she had already reprimanded 3 different staff members for various perceived failures in protocol and presentation. Charlotte calmly gathered her courage and gently pushed the door open further. She stepped into the room with a small, hopeful smile on her face, ready to share the wonderful news about the charity event. But before she could speak, the Dowager Queen's cold gaze fixed upon her, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The elderly woman's lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval as she examined her great-granddaughter from head to toe. Charlotte's dress, though clean and appropriate, was slightly wrinkled from the day's activities. A small grass stain marked the hem where she had knelt down to speak to a young child at the charity event. Her hair, carefully brushed that morning, had come loose from its clips during the excitement of the day. To Charlotte, these were simply the natural results of an active, meaningful day. To the Dowager Queen, they represented everything that was wrong with the modern royal family. Charlotte attempted a small curtsy, as she had been taught to do when greeting senior members of the family. But her execution was imperfect, rushed because of her nervousness. The Dowager Queen's expression grew even more severe. She set down her teacup with a sharp clink that echoed through the suddenly silent room. Every staff member present seemed to hold their breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The elderly woman rose slowly from her chair, using her ornate walking stick for support. Despite her age, she still carried herself with the bearing of someone who had ruled a nation. She moved toward Charlotte with deliberate steps, each one seeming to carry the weight of centuries of royal tradition. Charlotte instinctively took a small step backward, her flowers trembling slightly in her hands. She had never seen her great-grandmother look so stern. So utterly displeased, Charlotte tried to speak, to explain about the wonderful day she had experienced, about the children she had met and the money they had raised for those in need. But the Dowager Queen raised one hand, silencing her with nothing more than a gesture. The old woman's eyes bore into Charlotte's, and the young princess felt smaller with each passing second. She did not understand what she had done wrong, but she could feel the disapproval radiating from her great-grandmother, like cold winter wind. The Dowager began to speak, her voice low, but carrying clearly through the room. She spoke of tradition, of duty, of the proper way for a royal princess to conduct herself. She criticized Charlotte's appearance, her casual manner, and what she called the disgraceful way Charlotte had been allowed to mingle freely with common children without maintaining proper royal distance and dignity. Each word was carefully chosen, designed to cut and to correct. The elderly woman truly believed she was doing what was necessary to mold Charlotte into a proper royal princess. Charlotte's eyes began to fill with tears, though she tried desperately to hold them back. She had been so happy just moments ago, so proud of what she had accomplished. Now she felt ashamed, though she still did not fully understand why. The flowers in her hands, which had meant so much to her, suddenly seemed foolish and childish. She wished desperately that her parents were there. They were away on official duties and would not return until evening. The Dowager Queen was not finished. She declared that Charlotte's behavior reflected poorly on the entire royal family and that immediate correction was necessary. The old woman's face was set in hard lines of disapproval, and her voice grew colder with each passing moment. The staff members in the room looked increasingly uncomfortable, but none dared to intervene. The Dowager Queen was, after all, still royalty of the highest rank, and her word carried enormous weight within the palace walls. Charlotte could feel the eyes of everyone in the room upon her, watching her humiliation. She was just a child, trying her best to navigate the complex world of royal expectations while also remaining true to the kind, compassionate nature her parents had nurtured in her. The disconnect between what she had been taught at home and what her great-grandmother demanded was becoming painfully clear. She stood frozen in place, not knowing what to do or say, wishing she could simply disappear. The tension in the room continued to build, thick and suffocating. Outside, the sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon, and the palace staff went about their duties, unaware of the confrontation taking place in the drawing room. Royal Guard Thomas Mitchell had just begun his shift in the corridor outside, taking his position with the same dedication he brought to duty every day. He had served the royal family for 12 years and had always performed his responsibilities with distinction and honor. He had no idea that within minutes he would face a choice that would change his life forever. Royal Guard Thomas Mitchell stood at attention in the corridor, his uniform pressed to perfection, his posture reflecting years of military training and discipline. He was 34 years old, had served in the British Army before joining the Royal Protection Service, and took immense pride in his work. For him, protecting the royal family was not just a job, but a calling, a responsibility he took seriously every single day. He had been specially assigned to areas where Princess Charlotte might be present. As his calm demeanor and proven track record made him an excellent choice for protecting the young royals. Thomas had 3 children of his own, 2 daughters and a son, which gave him a special understanding of and connection to the young princes and princess he helped protect. He often saw his own children in Princess Charlotte when she would pass by with her bright smile and curious questions about his uniform and duties. He knew she was being raised to be kind and caring. and he had seen firsthand how she treated staff members with genuine respect and warmth. These qualities reminded him why he had chosen this path of service. As Thomas stood at his post, he became aware of raised voices coming from the drawing room. His training had taught him to be alert to any unusual sounds or situations that might indicate danger or distress. At first, he maintained his position as protocol dictated. Royal family members were entitled to their privacy, and guards were expected to remain at their posts, unless specifically summoned or unless there was clear evidence of a physical threat. But something about the tone of the voices made him uneasy. The door to the drawing room was not fully closed, and as the voices grew louder, Thomas could hear more clearly what was being said. He recognized the Dowager Queen's sharp, authoritative tone, cutting through the air like a blade. He also heard a younger voice, small and trembling, that he immediately identified as belonging to Princess Charlotte. His jaw tightened as he listened to the elderly woman's harsh criticism of the 8-year-old child. Every instinct he had as both a father and a protector was beginning to activate. Thomas knew that the Dowager Queen represented an older generation of royalty, one that valued strict adherence to protocol above all else. He had heard stories from other guards about her severity, about staff members who had been reduced to tears by her criticism. But he had never imagined he would hear her directing such harsh words at a young child, especially one as genuinely sweet-natured as Princess Charlotte. His hands clenched slightly at his sides, though his face remained impassive. Inside the drawing room, the confrontation had reached a critical point. The Dowager Queen had decided that words alone were not sufficient correction for Charlotte's perceived failures. In her mind, a more dramatic demonstration was necessary to impress upon the young princess the seriousness of royal protocol and hierarchy. The elderly woman straightened herself to her full height, gripping her walking stick firmly, and her voice took on an even more commanding tone that had silenced rooms full of dignitaries and heads of state. Charlotte stood trembling before her great-grandmother, tears now flowing freely down her young face. She still held the flowers, though several petals had fallen to the floor. She did not understand what was happening or why her great-grandmother was so angry with her. All she had wanted to do was help people, to make a difference, to use her position for good as her parents had taught her. Now she felt as though she had committed some terrible crime, though she could not name what it was. The Dowager Queen raised her walking stick and pointed it directly at Charlotte. Her voice rang out clear and cold through the room as she issued her command. She ordered Princess Charlotte to kneel before her immediately. Not a gentle kneel, not a curtsy, but a full, submissive kneel on both knees, as one would before a monarch in ancient times. She wanted Charlotte to physically demonstrate her understanding of hierarchy, her acknowledgement of her errors, and her submission to proper royal authority. The staff members in the room exchanged shocked glances. This was beyond anything they had witnessed before, even from the Dowager Queen. To demand that a young princess, child of the direct royal line, kneel in such a manner was extraordinary and deeply troubling. It went against every modern understanding of how royal children should be treated. But none of them dared to speak up. The Dowager Queen's authority was absolute in their minds, and the consequences of challenging her could be severe. Charlotte's eyes widened in shock and confusion. She looked around the room desperately, hoping someone would intervene, would tell her great-grandmother that this was wrong, that she did not deserve this treatment. But all she saw were averted eyes and uncomfortable faces. She felt utterly alone, small and powerless. Her hands shook so badly that she dropped the bouquet of flowers, which scattered across the marble floor. Her breath came in short, frightened gasps as she tried to process what was being demanded of her. Outside in the corridor, Thomas heard the command clearly. His body went rigid, and his face, which had maintained professional neutrality for years regardless of circumstances, showed unmistakable shock and anger. He knew exactly what such a command meant. This was not about teaching protocol or maintaining dignity. This was about power, about humiliation, about breaking a child's spirit in the name of tradition. Every protective instinct in his body screamed at him to act. Thomas faced an impossible choice in that moment. His duty as a royal guard was clear. He was to maintain his post, to not interfere in family matters, to protect the physical safety of the royals, but not to involve himself in their private affairs or disagreements. His career, his livelihood, his ability to provide for his own children all depended on following protocols strictly. He had signed contracts, taken oaths, and understood the serious consequences of overstepping his boundaries. To interfere now would almost certainly mean the end of his career, and possibly legal consequences. But Thomas was also a father. He thought of his own daughters, imagined them standing where Charlotte stood, being ordered to kneel in humiliation by someone who should be protecting them and nurturing them. He thought about the kind of person Princess Charlotte was, the genuine goodness he had observed in her over the years of serving near her. He thought about what kind of man he would be if he stood by and allowed this to happen. When he had the power to stop it, his mind raced through scenarios. He could pretend he had not heard anything. He could wait for the situation to resolve itself. He could report it later through proper channels. All of these options would keep him safe, would preserve his career and his future. But none of them would protect Charlotte in this moment. And he knew, deep in his soul, that if he chose the safe path now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. Some things mattered more than careers and consequences inside the room. Charlotte had begun to slowly lower herself toward the ground. Her whole body shook with sobs that she was trying desperately to hold back. The Dowager Queen stood watching with cold satisfaction, believing she was teaching an important lesson. The staff members looked away, unable to watch, but equally unable to intervene. The scene was one of absolute power being wielded against absolute vulnerability. Thomas made his decision in a heartbeat. He stepped away from his post and moved toward the drawing room door. His heart pounded in his chest, but his steps were steady and sure. He knew exactly what he was risking, but he also knew with absolute certainty that he was doing the right thing. Some duties transcended protocol, some protections went beyond physical safety, and some moments defined who you truly were as a human being. This was one of those moments. He reached the door just as Charlotte's knees were about to touch the cold marble floor. Without hesitation, without announcing himself, without asking permission, Thomas Mitchell pushed the door fully open and strode into the room. His presence was immediate and commanding, his military bearing evident in every line of his body. Every eye in the room turned to him in shock. Royal guards simply did not enter rooms uninvited. They did not interrupt royal family members. They certainly did not interfere in family matters. But Thomas was already committed to his course of action. The Dowager Queen's head snapped toward him, her face contorting with outrage at this unprecedented interruption. She opened her mouth to deliver what would undoubtedly be a scathing rebuke. But before she could speak, Thomas moved quickly across the room. He positioned himself directly between the elderly woman and Princess Charlotte, his body serving as a physical barrier. His face was set in lines of determination and barely controlled anger. Charlotte, who had been in the process of kneeling, froze in confusion. She looked up at Thomas with tear-filled eyes, not understanding what was happening, but sensing somehow that this man had come to help her. Thomas glanced down at her briefly, and in that moment, his expression softened just slightly. He gave her the smallest nod, a gesture that said without words that she was safe now, that he would not let anyone hurt her. Then Thomas turned his full attention back to the Dowager Queen. The elderly woman was sputtering with indignation, demanding to know what he thought he was doing, ordering him to leave immediately and return to his post. Her walking stick trembled in her hand. Whether from age or anger, it was impossible to tell. The staff members along the walls looked absolutely terrified, knowing they were witnessing something that could have enormous consequences for everyone present. Thomas stood his ground. His voice, when he finally spoke, was respectful but absolutely firm. He addressed the Dowager Queen with proper courtesy, acknowledging her rank and position. But he also made it clear that he could not and would not allow what was happening in this room to continue. He explained that his duty as a royal guard was to protect members of the royal family from all threats, and that included threats to their dignity and emotional well-being, regardless of where those threats originated. The room fell into absolute silence. No one had ever spoken to the Dowager Queen in such a manner. No one had ever challenged her authority so directly. The elderly woman's face turned several shades of red and purple. Her mouth opened and closed several times as she struggled to find words adequate to express her outrage. This was beyond anything she had experienced in her long life. A mere guard, a commoner in service, dared to defy her commands and question her judgment. Thomas knew there was no going back now. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. His career was over, he was certain of that. But as he stood between the Dowager Queen and Princess Charlotte, protecting a frightened child from humiliation and emotional harm, he felt absolutely certain that he had made the right choice. The Dowager Queen finally found her voice. And when she spoke, her words dripped with venom and authority accumulated over decades of absolute power. She demanded that Thomas be removed from the room immediately, and placed under arrest for insubordination and disrespect to a senior member of the royal family. She threatened him with imprisonment, with the destruction of his career, with consequences so severe that he would regret this moment for the rest of his life. Her walking stick struck the floor repeatedly, punctuating her words with sharp cracks that echoed through the drawing room. But Thomas remained unmoved. He had already accepted whatever consequences were coming, and threats no longer had any power over him. He stood tall and steady, his presence a wall of protection between Charlotte and her great-grandmother. Behind him, he could hear Charlotte's quiet sobs beginning to subside, could sense her taking refuge in his protection. That alone made everything worthwhile. He had served his country in war zones, had faced actual physical danger numerous times. But he had never felt more certain about a decision than he did in this moment. The staff members in the room were frozen in positions of absolute terror and confusion. They had no idea what protocol dictated in such a situation because nothing like this had ever happened before in their experience. Some of them had served the royal family for 30 or 40 years and had never witnessed such a direct confrontation between a guard and a senior royal. They knew they should probably intervene, should support the Dowager Queen's authority. But something about Thomas's actions had touched something deep within them as well. Many of them had been troubled by what they had witnessed, and seeing someone finally take a stand was both terrifying and inspiring. Charlotte slowly rose from her half-kneeling position. Staying behind Thomas's protective presence, she wiped at her tears with shaking hands, trying to compose herself but still feeling frightened and confused. She did not fully understand all the implications of what Thomas had done. She understood that he had protected her when she needed protection. She understood that he had chosen to help her, even when everyone else had remained silent. Her young mind was processing something important about courage and kindness in doing what was right even when it was difficult. The confrontation might have escalated further, but at that precise moment, the drawing room doors burst open again. The Prince of Wales, Charlotte's father, strode into the room with Charlotte's mother right behind him. They had returned early from their engagement after receiving an urgent message from a junior staff member who had been brave enough to send word about the situation developing at the palace. The expressions on their faces showed a mixture of concern, confusion, and growing anger as they took in the scene before them. The prince's eyes swept the room, taking in his daughter's tear-stained face, the scattered flowers on the floor, the Dowager Queen's expression of outrage, and Thomas Mitchell standing protectively between them. He was an intelligent man who had been navigating royal politics his entire life, and he understood the essential elements of what had transpired within seconds. His jaw tightened, and his usually gentle expression hardened into something far more formidable. Charlotte immediately ran to her father, throwing her arms around him and burying her face against his jacket. He held her close, one hand stroking her hair, while his eyes never left the Dowager Queen. The Princess of Wales moved to join them. Kneeling down to examine Charlotte and make sure she was physically unharmed, her face showed both relief that her daughter was safe and fury at whatever had caused such distress. She whispered gentle words to Charlotte, trying to calm and comfort her. The Dowager Queen began to speak, her voice still sharp with authority despite the changed circumstances. She started to explain her perspective, to justify her actions as necessary discipline and proper royal education. She described Charlotte's appearance and behavior as disgraceful, spoke about the importance of maintaining standards and hierarchy, and characterized her own actions as those of a concerned great-grandmother trying to correct dangerous modern laxity in royal upbringing. But the Prince of Wales raised his hand, silencing her with a gesture remarkably similar to the one she had used on Charlotte earlier. For perhaps the first time in her long life, the Dowager Queen found herself on the receiving end of such a dismissal. The prince's voice when he spoke was cold and controlled, each word carefully chosen and delivered with devastating precision. He thanked her for her concern but made it absolutely clear that his children's upbringing was not her responsibility and that her methods were neither welcome nor acceptable. He explained that Charlotte had spent her morning doing charity work, helping to raise money for underprivileged children, and showing exactly the kind of compassion and service that he and his wife wanted to instill in their children. He stated that if this made Charlotte's appearance less than perfectly pristine, then that was a price he was more than happy to pay. He spoke about modern values, about the kind of monarchy that could survive and thrive in the 21st century, and about treating children with dignity and respect rather than fear and humiliation. The Dowager Queen attempted to interrupt several times, but the prince continued speaking, his voice growing stronger with each word. He made it clear that, while he respected her service and her years of dedication to the crown, the days of ruling through fear and intimidation were over. He spoke about his vision for his children, for the monarchy they would inherit, and for the kind of leaders they needed to become. And he made it absolutely clear that subjecting an 8-year-old child to humiliation and demands, that she kneel in submission had no place in that vision. The elderly woman's face had gone through several more color changes during this speech. She was accustomed to deference, to having her views respected if not automatically accepted. To be so directly challenged by her own grandson was shocking and painful. But even in her anger and hurt, she could see that times had indeed changed. The authority she had wielded for so long was no longer absolute. The world had moved on, and she had not moved with it. The prince then turned his attention to Thomas Mitchell. The guards stood at attention, fully expecting to be dismissed or arrested despite the prince's defense of his daughter. He had broken protocol, had interfered in family matters, had challenged a senior royal's authority. There was no precedent for allowing such behavior to go unpunished, regardless of the circumstances or motivation. Thomas met the prince's gaze steadily, ready to accept whatever judgment came. But instead of anger or disappointment, the prince's expression softened into something that looked remarkably like respect and gratitude. He asked Thomas to explain his actions, to describe what he had witnessed, and why he had chosen to intervene. Thomas spoke clearly and honestly, describing exactly what he had heard and seen, explaining his reasoning and his decision-making process. He did not try to justify his actions or minimize the breach of protocol he had committed. He simply told the truth. The prince listened carefully, nodding occasionally. When Thomas finished, there was a long moment of silence in the room. Everyone present was acutely aware that whatever happened next would set a precedent. It would send a message about values and priorities. The staff members held their breath, watching their future king make a decision that would define not just Thomas's fate, but potentially the culture of royal service for years to come. The prince's next words surprised everyone in the room, except possibly his wife. He thanked Thomas for his service, for his courage, and for his willingness to put what was right above what was safe. He stated that Thomas had not violated his duty as a royal guard, but had instead fulfilled it in the truest and most important way possible. He had protected a member of the royal family from harm, and the fact that the harm was emotional rather than physical did not make it any less real or the protection any less necessary. The Dowager Queen made a sound of protest, but the prince continued speaking. He announced that Thomas would not face any disciplinary action, that his intervention had been appropriate under the circumstances, and that his actions reflected exactly the kind of judgment and character that the royal family needed in its protection service. He went further, stating that this incident would prompt a review of protocols to ensure that protecting the emotional and psychological well-being of family members was explicitly included in the duties of royal guards, especially those assigned to protect children. The room erupted in whispered conversations among the staff members. This was unprecedented, revolutionary even. The prince was not merely defending Thomas's specific action, but was essentially rewriting the rules about what protection meant and where a guard's duty ended and family. Privacy began. It was a bold statement about values and priorities. It's about the kind of leadership he intended to provide when he eventually became king. Thomas felt as though he could breathe again for the first time since entering the room. He had been prepared for the end of his career, possibly worse. Instead, he was being commended and held up as an example. It was overwhelming, and he had to work to maintain his professional composure. Behind him, he heard Charlotte's small voice asking if Thomas was in trouble, her father's gentle response that Thomas was a hero who had done exactly the right thing. The Dowager Queen, seeing that she had been thoroughly defeated in this confrontation, drew herself up with as much dignity as she could muster. She announced that she would be returning to her own residence immediately, and that she would be communicating with other family members about what she characterized as a serious breach of respect and tradition, but her voice lacked its earlier authority. She knew she had lost not just this battle, but perhaps the war itself. The world she had known and ruled was truly gone. She swept from the room with her walking stick clicking sharply against the floor, trailed by two of her personal attendants. The remaining staff members visibly relaxed when she was gone. Though they remained uncertain about their own positions and how this incident might affect them, the prince assured them that no one would face consequences for what had happened, that they had been placed in an impossible situation, and that he understood their difficult position. Charlotte emerged from her father's embrace and walked slowly over to Thomas. She looked up at him with her tear-stained face and said simply, "Thank you." Her voice was small but sincere, carrying more gratitude than any formal commendation ever could. Thomas knelt down to her level, something he would never normally do while on duty, and told her gently that she had done nothing wrong, that she should be proud of her charity work, and that she should never let anyone make her feel ashamed of her kindness and compassion. The Princess of Wales joined them, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder in a gesture of warmth and appreciation that transcended the usual boundaries between royals and staff. She thanked him not just for protecting Charlotte, but for showing such courage and moral clarity. She told him that his children should be very proud of their father, and that she hoped her own children would grow up to have the same kind of courage he had demonstrated. The prince announced that the family would be having a private dinner that evening. It's just the immediate family, so that Charlotte could process what had happened in a safe and supportive environment. He dismissed the staff with words of appreciation and reassurance. As people began to leave the drawing room, Thomas prepared to return to his post, but the prince asked him to wait for a moment. Once the room was nearly empty, he spoke to Thomas privately, man to man rather than prince to guard. The Prince of Wales looked at Thomas with an expression that held both admiration and a deeper understanding of the sacrifice that had been made. He spoke quietly, acknowledging that Thomas had put everything on the line, his career and his family's security, to do what he believed was right. He told Thomas that such courage was rare and precious, and that the royal family was fortunate to have people of such character in their service. The words were simple, but they carried genuine emotion and respect that went far beyond formal gratitude. Thomas responded with equal honesty, explaining that he had 3 children of his own and could not have lived with himself if he had stood by and allowed Charlotte to be humiliated in such a manner. He spoke about the kind of example he wanted to set for his own sons and daughters, about teaching them that protecting the vulnerable was more important than protecting your own comfort or security. He admitted that in the moment, he had not thought about consequences, had acted purely on instinct and conviction. The prince nodded in understanding, then surprised Thomas by asking about his family, about his children and their ages and interests. For several minutes, they spoke not as prince and guard, but as 2 fathers, discussing the challenges and joys of raising children in a complex world. It was a conversation that Thomas would treasure for the rest of his life, not because of the royal connection, but because it showed him that despite all the differences in their circumstances, they shared fundamental values about what mattered most in life. Before Thomas left the room, the prince made one more statement that would prove to have lasting significance. He told Thomas that he wanted him to remain assigned to Charlotte's protection detail, that he could think of no one better suited to help keep his daughter safe. But he added that he wanted Thomas to understand his role broadly, to continue using his judgment to protect Charlotte, not just from physical threats but from any situation that might harm her emotionally or psychologically. He was, in effect, expanding Thomas's authority and responsibility in unprecedented ways. Thomas accepted this assignment with a sense of honor and purpose that exceeded anything he had felt before in his career. He understood that he was being entrusted with something far more important than simple security duties. He was being asked to be a guardian in the fullest sense of the word, to help protect not just Charlotte's safety, but her spirit and her sense of self. It was a responsibility he would take seriously for years to come. News of the incident spread through the palace. With remarkable speed, despite efforts to keep it quiet, royal staff members talked in hushed voices about what had happened, about Thomas's intervention and the prince's response. The story took on different forms as it passed from person to person, but the essential elements remained consistent. Many staff members who had served under the old protocols, who had witnessed or experienced harsh treatment in the name of tradition, felt something shift in their understanding of their roles and their rights. In the days following the incident, several significant changes began to take shape within the palace structure. The prince initiated a comprehensive review of protocols related to the treatment of royal children and the responsibilities of those assigned to protect them. He consulted with child psychologists, education experts, and former military personnel to develop guidelines that balanced security needs with emotional well-being. Thomas was invited to participate in these discussions, his perspective valued as someone who had demonstrated both professional competence and moral courage. The new protocols that emerged from these discussions were groundbreaking in many ways. They explicitly stated that protecting royal children included protecting them from psychological harm, regardless of its source. They empowered guards and staff members to speak up if they witnessed treatment of children that they believed to be inappropriate or harmful. They created confidential reporting channels and protections for those who raised concerns. And they emphasized that maintaining royal dignity did not require sacrificing basic human kindness and respect. These changes were not universally welcomed. Some members of the older generation of royal staff and distant family members felt that the prince was being too radical, too willing to abandon traditions that had served the monarchy for centuries. There were quiet conversations in certain circles about whether he was fit to eventually take the throne, whether he understood the importance of maintaining royal mystique and authority. But these voices were increasingly in the minority, drowned out by broader public support for a more modern, compassionate approach to royal life. The public eventually learned about the incident through carefully managed press releases that emphasized the positive aspects of the story, Thomas's courage and the prince's progressive leadership. The response was overwhelmingly supportive. People across the nation and around the world praised Thomas as a hero who had stood up for a child when it mattered most. Parents especially connected with his actions, seeing in him the kind of courage they hoped they would have in similar circumstances. The incident became a talking point about power, authority, and the importance of protecting children even from family members who might harm them. Thomas found himself thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight. He was not a man who sought attention or recognition. The sudden media interest in his life and his family was challenging to navigate. Reporters wanted interviews, photographers followed him, and strangers recognized him on the street. His children struggled with the sudden attention at their schools, where they were alternately celebrated and teased as the kids of the guard who challenged the queen his wife had to deal with. Intrusive questions and unwanted attention. Whenever she went shopping or took the children to activities, the palace public relations team worked to shield Thomas and his family from the worst of the media attention. Issuing statements asking for privacy and respect, the Princess of Wales personally called Thomas's wife to express sympathy for the disruption to their lives and to offer any support that might be helpful. These gestures meant a great deal to Thomas's family and helped them weather the storm of public interest. Gradually, as news stories emerged and captured public attention, the intense focus on Thomas began to fade to more manageable levels. For Charlotte herself, The incident became a formative memory that would shape her understanding of courage, kindness, and moral responsibility. In the immediate aftermath, she struggled with feelings of confusion and residual fear. She had nightmares about her great-grandmother's cold eyes and harsh words. But her parents worked carefully with her, helping her process what had happened in age-appropriate ways. They emphasized that she had done nothing wrong, that helping others was always right, and that Thomas had shown her what it meant to stand up for what is right, even when it is difficult. Charlotte also learned an important lesson about power and its proper use. She saw that having authority, whether as a royal or in any other capacity, came with responsibilities to use that power wisely and kindly. She understood that tradition and protocol were important, but should never be used to justify cruelty or humiliation. And she saw in Thomas an example of quiet heroism, the kind that comes not from dramatic gestures, but from simple moral courage in everyday moments. The relationship between Charlotte and Thomas evolved in the months and years following the incident. While he remained professional in his duties, there was an unspoken bond between them, an understanding that transcended their different roles. Charlotte knew that Thomas was someone she could trust absolutely, someone who would always prioritize her well-being over rules or conventions. Thomas, for his part, felt a special responsibility for Charlotte's happiness and development, wanting to ensure that she grew up strong, confident, and kind, despite the unique pressures of royal life. The Dowager Queen's response to the incident and its aftermath was complex and evolved over time. Initially, she was furious and felt betrayed by her grandson's public rejection of her methods and values. She retreated to her private residence and refused to attend several family functions, making her displeasure known through icy silence and pointed absences. She considered the incident a personal humiliation and a sign that everything she had worked for throughout her long life was being carelessly discarded. But as months passed and she had time to reflect, something began to shift in the elderly woman's perspective. She received letters from people who had experienced similar harsh treatment as children, who described the lasting damage such experiences had caused. She was visited by some of her own children and grandchildren, who gently shared memories of times when her strict adherence to protocol and tradition had hurt them or made them feel unloved. These conversations were difficult and painful, forcing her to confront aspects of her life and choices that she had never questioned before. The Dowager Queen also watched from a distance as Charlotte continued to grow and develop. Observing the young princess's genuine warmth and connection with people from all walks of life, she saw how the public responded to Charlotte's authentic kindness, how it made the monarchy more relatable and beloved. She began to understand, however reluctantly, that her great-granddaughter's approach might actually be better suited to ensuring the monarchy's survival in modern times than her own rigid adherence to ancient protocols. Eventually, the Dowager Queen reached out to the Prince of Wales, requesting a private meeting. It was a difficult conversation for both of them, filled with tension and unspoken emotions. But the elderly woman did something she had rarely done in her long life. She admitted that she might have been wrong. She did not fully embrace all the changes happening in the royal family, but she acknowledged that her treatment of Charlotte had been excessive, and that she had let her commitment to tradition blind her to the needs of a vulnerable child. The prince accepted her apology with grace and suggested that, perhaps, she might like to spend some time with Charlotte in a different context, without the pressure of formal protocol and with other family members present to ensure everyone felt comfortable. The Dowager Queen agreed, and over the following year, she and Charlotte developed a new, more gentle relationship. The elderly woman learned to show affection in ways she had never done before, and Charlotte learned that people could change and grow even late in life. Thomas Mitchell continued his service with the royal family for many more years. He became something of a legend within the palace staff, respected not just for that one moment of courage, but for his consistent integrity and dedication. He was eventually promoted to head of the Royal Children's Protection Detail, a position that allowed him to implement many of the new protocols he had helped develop. He trained new guards not just in security procedures, but in the importance of treating royal family members with both protection and respect for their dignity and humanity. His own children grew up with a powerful example of moral courage. They saw that their father had been willing to risk everything for what he believed was right, and they learn that true strength comes not from having power, but from being willing to use whatever power you have to protect those who need protection. Thomas's eldest daughter eventually chose a career in child protection services, directly inspired by her father's example. His younger children also pursued careers focused on service and helping others. For Charlotte, the lessons learned from that afternoon in the drawing room stayed with her throughout her life. As she grew older and took on more royal responsibilities, she never forgot how vulnerable she had felt in that moment and how much it had meant to have someone stand up for her. She made it a priority in all her work to be aware of power dynamics, to use her position to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard, and to ensure that people under her authority were treated with dignity and respect. When Charlotte eventually participated in official royal duties as a young woman, she often requested that Thomas be part of her security detail. It became a sort of quiet tradition, a way of acknowledging the bond they shared and the moment that had shaped both their lives. On her 18th birthday, Charlotte personally thanked Thomas again for what he had done all those years ago, telling him that his courage had taught her more about true nobility than any protocol or tradition ever could. The incident ultimately became a turning point not just for the individuals involved, but for the royal institution itself. It represented a shift from a monarchy rooted primarily in tradition and hierarchy, to one that balanced those important elements with modern values of compassion, emotional intelligence, and respect for individual dignity. It showed that protection meant more than physical safety, that courage sometimes meant standing up to authority, and that true nobility came from character rather than title. Years later, when historians and biographers examined this period of royal history, many pointed to this seemingly small incident as emblematic of larger changes in how the monarchy understood its role and responsibilities. It became a teaching example in leadership courses used to discuss ethics, courage, and the proper use of authority. The image of a single guard standing between a frightened child and an angry authority figure became symbolic of the eternal tension between tradition and progress, between power and compassion. Thomas Mitchell eventually retired from royal service after a distinguished career. At his retirement ceremony, attended by multiple members of the royal family, the prince, by then king, spoke about the importance of moral courage and credited Thomas with helping to reshape the culture of royal service for the better. Charlotte, now a young woman, presented Thomas with a private gift, a framed photograph of a small bouquet of flowers with a simple inscription, thanking him for teaching her what true courage looked like.